Let's look at the creation of dynamic chart using drop-down lists and name manager. In this case, we have a company with a list of data points for a date range from 2019 to 2036. So some historicals and some forecast numbers, some balance sheet and income statement numbers, some cash flow statement items, and of course some credit statistics and ratios. We want to allow the user to be able to choose which data item they want to plot and also for what date range. And we want to have a dynamic chart that would expand and contract based on whatever range of data points or whatever date range the user would choose, and of course the data point that they want to plot. Let's look at the final product to see how it looks like. As we see, we have a start and end date. The user can define the date to be between 2019 and 2023, and this chart automatically updates, and it looks quite presentable. And of course, they can choose what data item they want to plot. I want to look at financing cash flows, and we see there's nothing, and then there's negative financing cash flow, and I can use for what date range. I want to look at the current ratio, and I can see that it's 2.4, 2.3, 1.7 is pretty. It's definitely above 1, good company. And I can change this range from 2023 to 2036, and it updates. So how do we create this plot if we want to create a summary dashboard and we want to have this presentable or presented in PowerPoint slides? First of all, this chart is linked to the data that is prepared on this tab, sheet 2, and we're going to only plot these data points from revenues to return on equity. So we're not plotting all of these data items. So we have to prepare the data first, and this is what we have done here. The second step is we have linked this data point, this table or this data that we have prepared to the first sheet, which is the source of the data, such that it's linked to the start and end date. So if the user chooses only 3 years, all the rest of the data is disappearing, and we're only seeing 2019 to 2021 data. And then the graph or the plot is linked to this data point. So step 1 is to prepare the data, and let's see how we can prepare the data. Step 2 is to create dynamic ranges or using name ranges to be able to define the x-axis or x data point and the y data points as it comes to the plot or plotting it in the graph, and as we define the data source. So let's look at the date ranges. Let's have the whole date range to 2036 now, and see how we can prepare this data. It's pretty simple. We have done this through introduction of some flags into the model. And let's see how we can do this. First, we can have the data label. In this case, we're going to look at revenues. Great. For what date ranges? Well, we're going to look at from 2019 up until 2036. Of course, not 2037. And these are our revenue numbers. Great. So now let's define the start and end date for the input: start date and end date. We can have a list, and the shortcut for that is Alt-DL, and that brings the list. And let's have a source from 2019 to 2036. Control-C, Control-V to have it the same format for the end date. So we can choose from 2020 to 2026 or 2025 as our start and end date. So now how do we make this range dynamic? Let's look at the dates first. We did this with the creation. There are many different ways to do it in Excel. We did it through flags. we define 3 different types of flags. And first is to say if the state is smaller or is larger and equal to the start date. And we're going to log it. It's going to be a false, it's not. In the meantime, on the same token, let's say if 2019 or the date is larger or equal to that date, which is true, smaller or equal to 2025. So we have to ensure that if this date is between 2020 and 2025, it'll appear. The third flag is the multiplication of these two numbers. It's a 0. I want to format it as a 1, as a false. Control 1, go to custom, and just write true if it's positive, semicolon if it's negative, nothing, and then false if it's 0. Great, so now it appears as false. Let's drag these line items. Great, so now we can see if we say 2024 or 2021, we can see we can only see these two. The flag will return true, and the rest are false. How do we edit this line item? We say if this flag is equal to a 0, we want a blank. Otherwise, we want the actual date. Drag it. Great. So now let's choose a different range, 2025. It's updating. Let's choose a different range, 2035. It's updating, and there's nothing else here. And then you can hide this by grouping these, Alt-A-G-G, group it, and close it. How do we make the revenue dynamic? We can link it to the date because we've already made this range dynamic. For this linking, we can say if this cell and we lock the row, which is row 62, equals to a blank, then we have a blank. Otherwise, we have the sheet 1 link that we had. Control-Alt-V, control formulas, copy formulas, and you see between 2020 and 2035, these numbers are appearing, and for the rest are not. Let's choose a different range. Let's choose 2022, these 3 data points. On the same token, we have grouped these flags. All of these numbers are linked in the same manner. Revenues, operating income. If the data label is blank, if the date is appearing and it's not blank, we're going to see the date. Otherwise, we're not. The other thing to notice is that for start and end date, we use a name range. Start this name manager to have it defined as start and end date. It's just much easier to say on the date if the flags, when we're looking at it, if this sheet to 2019, the sheet 1 reference is larger than the start date, and if it's smaller than the end date, it's between the start and end date, then it's a true flag, true. The multiplications are true. It just makes it more understandable when you're looking at the formulas. Let's see how we can plot it. We have a list for start and end date. We can have a start. We can have a list for the list that we want the user to be able to choose from. So Alt-DL. Very simply, we have chosen C10 to C32 in this sheet, the data labels or the data items that we want to plot. Basically, the user can plot, or we can choose what they want to plot. The cap ratio, return on capital, total liabilities to equity. This plot is linked to this data that we prepared. And the reason that we prepared the data is because if something goes wrong, we always know that something is going wrong here, and it's not in the source of the data. So we can build a model, we can make a balance sheet balance, or the cash flow waterfall, whatever we're preparing. And then we come to the actual or the summary tab, and we can have a prepared data set, and we can link this graph only to the data set that we're preparing. We're plotting only one line item. So let's say we are having a current selection and we're defining it such that based on the start and end date, or based on the date that we have, and based on the item that the user have chosen, this row would populate. So for that, we can simply use an index and match. We can say index, it's the array. What do we want to choose from? Basically, the array is the data points that we have. So we can say index, this is my data range, and I have it all from 2019 to 2036. You can lock it. And then we have to match for defining the row number and the column number, or the X and the Y axis. You're looking up this line item, or this number, what the user have chosen as a label that we want to plot in this range. Lock it. The lookup value was this line item, and you choose 0 for exact match. And you choose the same thing for the dates. So again, match this date in this range, and we want a 0. Forgot to close it. So 1.8, 1.08, control 1, number, and here's the formatting 1.01, and we can just drag it. What mistake did we make? Oh, we didn't lock. We did not lock the red. C39. Now we can see what the number is. Now let's just change this data range from 2036 to 2021. Hey, there's nothing. There are numbers there, but there's nothing because it's blank. Here's blank, it's going to come as blank. I'm going to show you now how this is dynamic. So let's insert a graph. Okay. And then select data. Add the data. The series name is going to be total liabilities over equity. The series values are going to be these numbers. And of course, the data range is going to be 2019, 2036. Great, look at it, it's beautiful. But now change the range from 2019 to 2030s. Now you can see that we were able to see the rest of the data points from 2022 to 2036. But here the X range, the X axis updated from 2019 to 2022. The best way to be able to create a dynamic chart, especially on the X and Y axis, that expands and contracts based on whatever the user defines, is to use the index function and name managers. And this is what we have done here. Let's clear this to no fill and go back to black. If you look at this format, what it is index colon index. And what it's doing is it's returning a reference. In this case, when I'm choosing 2019 to 2022, I want to return E34 to H83. And this is done by index. And once we create the formulas, we can give it to the name manager, we can pass it on to name managers and call it current selection. And we can do the same for the dates. And we have the dates in the name manager. We have the values as current selection in the name manager. And all we would do is then pass on the name manager the names that we have defined, or the name ranges in the name manager, to the plot as the X and Y axis, and the plot would update automatically. So how do we write these index functions? We write index. What array are we looking at? Well, the values are in this array. Great. F4, just to lock it. Always lock it, especially when it is passed to the name manager. It needs to be locked. What is a row number? We need to match. We need to match the start date value in our date range, which is here. F4, and we need the exact match. Close, close. And of course, we need the same formula, but in this case, we're going to match the end date. And index, closing the match function, index. Here it is. It was end date. Great. And you see this is a spill error. It's actually what's possible to see under Excel 365, but an older version we might actually not be able to see the array. In that case, we can actually go into the formula, select it, and click F9, and we can see the values. Same thing for the date, but in the date, we do not need to look into the current selection anymore. We're looking into row E5. We're saying index row E5, look in this range, match the start date and match the end date as the start and end points in the range, and that will return 2019 to 2022. So let's 2036, change the start and end date, and you can see the date is going from 2019 to 2032. Both of these indices that we defined, index functions that we defined for the actual current selection values, going from the start value of 1.08 to 0.049, which is the same value that we are seeing here under current selection. We would then, what we do is we copy this formula, Control C, Control F3, to see the name managers, and then to see the name manager window and create new. We can create new, but we have already defined the current selection and of course the dates. Just edit, and we copy it in the refers to section, and we can give it a name. In this case, we have given it the name of a current selection, and the same goes for dates. We name it dates, and we give it a refers to the index formula, index sheet row E5 to V5, and then we match the start and end date in this range to get the start and end date in the array, and that will give us a series of data points based on what the user's start and end date is. So now let's update this total liabilities, because it's currently static. If I chose this made this 2030, as you see, this updates and this one hasn't updated. So now let's select the data points and edit. Okay, great. The series name is this label, or the data label that the user defined. But for the series values, we're going to have the reference sheet 2 exclamation mark. It's important. And then we're going to have current selection. And for dates, we're going to have sheet 2 exclamation mark dates. This is how we're passing on the name ranges or the names that we defined and click OK. Voila! The graph updated. They both updated. Now if I change this range and turn it into 2036, this updates and this updates. We can add data labels. Great. We can get rid of this x-axis and make it a little shorter or longer depending on how you want these numbers to appear. You can make it longer so you can see it. The other issue is that we might actually see some negative numbers. So let's look at, for instance, net cash flows, like financing cash flows in this case, to see that these are negative and it's going over the x-axis. So how can we address it? We can change the position of the axis. The numbers are fine, but the position we can put in the lower range, and we can actually see it in the lower range. So that's one thing we can do. And of course, we can bring it up a bit. And we can define the unit, which is US thousands of US dollars in this case. We bring it down. And we can make it a bit longer. So there's a bit space in between the numbers, and you can see that. So now they're both updated. So if I change this to 2030, they both updated. So now we have a dynamic chart that expands and contracts based on whatever the user defines as the date range and whatever they want to see being plotted, which is in this case current assets. We're looking at return on capital in this case from a list. So we defined how to create a dynamic chart with a drop-down list using name managers to allow the user to create a plot that expands and contracts based on whatever user defines as a start and end date, and of course, based on whatever the user would like to see plotted on the graph.